Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and we are continuing our look at the Pacific War. And this show, you will notice, is a fairly hastily organized one because I found myself at a gap today. Well, someone has come in to fill that gap. Trent Telenko has been on twice before, once with a couple others and once on his own. This is his third appearance, but second solo. And he's going to take us through the really interesting story of 1945 in Okinawa, which covers friendly fire, kamikazes, radar, naval doctrine, anti-aircraft, all sorts of things. If you know Trent Telenko from his work on Twitter and Threads, and he's a fantastic analyst of military history, both events of the past and also today. And I'll bring him in now. So good afternoon, Trent. How are you today?
I'm doing wonderfully well. I threw this together as fast as I could when you said you had the whole.
Well, it was good. And I'm glad it when people sort of have a half ready to go, microwave ready presentation. So it's great. So for those who don't know you, your interest is not just radar, but technology, intelligence, the science behind warfare. Where did your interest in all that aspect of it come? Because some people like the tanks, some people like the aircraft. What got you interested in kind of the technical gubbins behind it all?
Well, the backstage to World War II is things like radio communications, radar, how you organize the logistics of war. And all of that is done through radio and telephone and telegraph. And you really can't understand what's going on unless you have that backstage to fill in and give you the context of what's going on. There's more to war than fighting. Logistics is everything in war except the shooting and the close combat. And you've got to understand that part of the war for the stories at the front end to have context. And that's where I've gone with this. And my interest in Okinawa actually predated my interest in Section 22 because I was reading the histories and they made no sense to me because I knew a little bit from my day job. I worked as an inspector, then a quality auditor, then a quality staff specialist for the Department of Defense. So I dealt with lots of the gubbins behind the front line. And in knowing those things, I read that story and it made no sense to me. And where it didn't make sense was the radar part of it, because radar is for integrated air defenses. What grass is for an ecology on a prairie. I mean, either you have critters that eat grass or critters that eat the critters that eat grass. Radar is kind of like grass. And that is the basis of this particular slideshow. So let's...
Brilliant. And, I would just add it's that, as we will find out, radar is a bit like the code breaking. It's only as good as what is done with the information. It's only as good as how the information gathered from radar is interpreted, analyzed, and then passed on to those who need to know. Because in the last few years, we've had this kind of maybe oversell of some of these technologies as, the breaking of the codes won the war. And it's only as good as the operator, but I'll let you get into that as we go. So, folks, I think we'll do questions at the end today because I'm knowing how Trent puts these things together. I don't think there'll be many questions as we go along because he's kind of the detail guy. It'll get covered, but we will feel free to throw your comments up there. But basically, we'll sit back and learn about this really incredible story. So, over to you, sir.
All right. All right. What you're looking at here is Torishima behind Nemesis Island, the title. One of the things that pops up again and again researching World War II is how certain narratives get established in the record. These narratives often have nowhere near the ground truth found in primary source documents of the time, but they serve the bureaucratic powers that be in post-war battles. These narratives are repeated over and over again by historians without validating the narratives against the theater's original wartime documents. This is pretty much the case for 6 April 1945 at Okinawa. It was the single worst day of the Okinawa campaign. It was a day that America's Pacific amphibious doctrine failed. And on that day, the Japanese commenced Operation Kikasui as a part of its decisive battle strategy at Okinawa. All right. I'm going to, at this point, tell you what I'm going to tell you. This is my table of contents. I've got this split up into chapters, and that way you'll know we're progressing. And let's talk about the two hidden disasters at Okinawa that disappeared from the historical record. But first, let's give you a little bit of background. Between September of 44 and March of 1945, the Okinawa planning cycle was dominated by a really poisonous dispute known as Smith versus Smith that happened in the Marianas in June of 1944. The planning for Okinawa was, the bandwidth was eaten up by the Iwo Jima landing. So a lot of really good detailed planning wasn't happening because you had another operation that was over the top of it. And part of the planning and the effort involved peeling away the 24th Corps of the United States Army from General Douglas MacArthur in the Leyte campaign, getting it set up and throwing it at Okinawa. And one final thing. In December of 1944, there was a congressional fact-finding mission about the pending merger of the War and Navy departments. And this ate everyone's mind going into Okinawa. Next. Now, on the right, you're looking at General Buckner and Admiral Turner and General Oliver Smith, respectively, of the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. The text that I'm on the left is the biggest problem with Central Pacific amphibious doctrine was something called deconfliction. Because integrated air defenses did not exist in the interwar period, the United States Navy never wargamed how to integrate land-based air defenses covering a landing with naval-based air defenses. And as a result, at Okinawa, there were two really major disasters. One from friendly fire and one from the U.S. Navy not protecting U.S. Army amphibious transports at Querétaro. And taken together, these two disasters utterly, it caused a cascading systems malfunction in the logistics for Okinawa. Now, this slide to the right shows a number of ships that were hit by friendly fire on that day, 6 April 1945. They come from a study titled Americide at Sea, Friendly Fire Incidents During World War II Naval Operations. There were 52 ship-to-ship U.S. Navy friendly fire incidents in World War II covered in the study. Of those, in those 52 instances, 186 American servicemen were killed, and a further 438 U.S. servicemen on those ships and craft were wounded. Of those 52 incidences, 25 happened in amphibious operations, and some 40 happened overall in 1945. 22 of those 25 amphibious incidences were at Okinawa, and 7 were specifically at Higuchi Beach, Anchorage, on the 6th of April. And they killed 2 people and wounded 17. And if you look at the spreadsheet, you'll see all the sources for all the different ships. I went in and made sure that the crunchy details of who and how people got wounded and died are there. Next. All right. The reason those ships got mauled was there were waves and waves of kamikazes coming over Yantan airfield, and 2 American fighters were shot down in the scrum. The second of the 2 fighters, an example is on the left, an FM-2 flew low over the anchorage to land at Yantan, which at that point was an emergency airfield in case fighters were damaged. This particular fighter was. As he came over the fleet at the anchorage, he was blown out of the sky, and the wreckage of his fighter landed on 2 barges full of aviation gasoline, blowing them up and causing a huge cascading problem with fueling of aircraft throughout the campaign. This is the second thing that happened. What you're seeing on the left is photographs of USS Terror, which was a seaplane tender, and at the road stand anchorage at Karama Reto near Okinawa. She was the flagship of Admiral Alexander Sharp, the commander of the mine craft of the Pacific Fleet. And actually, she was a mine layer, not a seaplane tender, excuse me. In the left center, you're seeing a U.S. naval ammunition ship, the USS Josephus Victory. It was one of 15 ammunition ships present in Karama-Reto that day for the Navy and 3 for the 10th Army. The SOPA, that is Senior Officer Present Afloat, Admiral Killian, told those 2 vessels to leave the West Anchorage, and they were set upon by kamikazes and both blown up. These 2 vessels had all the spare mortar ammunition for the Central Pacific. All right. We're going to go into standard narratives, and these are the standard radar narratives of the battle, and most people that have studied this battle will be familiar with them. This is the first one. The narrative of the picket ships, the picket destroyers, protecting the fleet at Okinawa and taking grievous damage. Of the 19 fighter director teams that were on these picket destroyers, 63% of them were either dead or casualties 46 days into the operation. And at right, you're looking at where the various pickets were located throughout the campaign. This is the second, and it's a lesser known one, but it is documented by the reporter Robert Sherrod in the History of Marine Aviation in World War II. What you're looking at is where the Marines were located at the lower left, and at the right, you're looking at their radar control facilities in the Air Defense Control Center between Yantan and Kandina airfields. All right, now we're going to get into the narratives that are not really there. We're starting with the U.S. Army. Now, the reason why I had Torishima at the front of this presentation was to lead up to this particular slide. What you're looking at is how that island was outfitted with radars, with identification friend or foe, with radio direction finding to serve as a unsinkable picket destroyer to protect the anchorage at Hagushi Beach and elsewhere in the Okinawa island chain. The standard narrative, the Marine Corps had 2 organizations that did radar in World War II. One was their air warning squadrons, which were originally attached to aircraft squadrons. I talked about this in the earlier Guadalcanal presentation. The other is the defense battalions, which were also at Guadalcanal, turned into anti-aircraft battalions. Both of these organizations were built around protecting or evolved to protect small Central Pacific islands. U.S. Army radar units were built for a different set of missions. They were essentially Lego building blocks of organizations that were built around specific radars for specific reasons and were meant to be task organized like field artillery. This reflected Army Ground Force Commander General McNair's idea of having lots of small interchangeable units that can be plugged and played into any field organization. Both of these outfits were present at Okinawa, and they had to work together with the United States Navy to protect the anchorages. The difference between the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Army was the Army followed a War Department doctrine about bomb release lines. You built your air defenses around keeping bombers from being able to get a clear shot through their sights for a good, clean bomb drop. You wanted to have shells exploding in the face of the navigators so they flinched and the bombs would miss. This was not possible in small coral atolls. You had the land you had, and you put up anti-aircraft wherever there was room. The Army, working with the Army Air Force using RAF doctrine, built around this bomb line as a part of an integrated air defense. The Navy and Marine Corps simply did not do that, and this showed up as a problem during the course of the Okinawa campaign.
Just a quick question for you, Trent, because you're the radar guy, and this is going to be a dumb question from a non-radar guy. But when we've done shows in the past about, for example, air interdiction in North Africa and El Alamein and things like that, is with the radar technology the US are using, who drives the doctrine? Do the radar developers and scientists tell the military what it can do, or do the military tell the radar designers what they want it to do, or is it sort of some horrible combination of the two?
I'm going to check off. It's a horrible combination of the two. The problem with radar and integrated air defense at the time was anyone who was any good was very young and very low ranking, or they were a civilian separate from the outfit. Getting the flag ranks all pointed in one direction and talking to each other was a whole lot more of an exercise in work than it was getting all the individual pieces together to make the kit work. The doctrine to integrate the control of aircraft through radar and getting the different pieces of a radar network to talk to each other in a manner that everyone can understand was a huge pain. And the Army, the War Department, tended to use one way and the Navy another. And we will review that in a little bit.
Okay.
You're just a little bit ahead. I want to show you here. I talked about the U.S. Navy ammunition ship. You'll see it on the right along with USS Terror. What you're looking at is the Kurama Reto Western Anchorage. You're seeing in front of it a 40 millimeter Bofors gun that is manned by a U.S. Army unit, which set up per its doctrine, trying to get anti-aircraft guns on the ground far enough in front of the target to engage incoming aircraft before they could line up to destroy vessels. And at left, you're looking at a Maxim gun that is 450 caliber guns in a mount that is sitting on an airfield on Okinawa later in this campaign. And the idea of the quad 50 caliber was whenever someone came down in a dive bomber, he would face 4 machine guns full of fire coming up in its face with tracers to make him flinch so he wouldn't drop his bomb accurately. All right. What you're seeing here is how the various organizations for radar on Okinawa organize themselves and with what. On the left, you see the 2 organizations from the Marine Corps, which are large, non-homogeneous. They have lots of different pieces in one big unit, essentially built to protect an island. On the right, you see the 4 different kinds of radar units, each with one radar, one lean organization, and intended to operate together as a task force. So the Marines, we built everything in one organization so we don't have to worry. The Army, we built lots of different small organizations that knew the doctrine to work together. Getting these 2 organizations to work together at Okinawa was a pain. And this is where the pain begins. On the left, you're looking at the one copy of the Pickett diagram that was used by Admiral King and Captain Moosbrugger and their successors to control aircraft throughout the Okinawa campaign. In the center, you're looking at a searchlight battery unit with Army Air Defense, and they use grids, squares. This is the RAF way of controlling fighters that the American War Department copied. Those 2 ways of talking about how you control aircraft are different. And the Army, as you see there in the center, and the Marine Corps both used grids when the Navy wasn't around, but they had to adapt to the Navy way of doing business when the Navy was in charge of the anchorage. This happened, getting the ground-based and sea-based portions of the anti-invasion to work together was really hard, and it was one of the background pieces of the Smith versus Smith controversy in the Marianas. All right. Now, chapter 3. This is where we get into some of the stuff that I've talked about with section 22. In that organization, our special interest group, I was the Japanese radar guy. And these were the things that I was looking at Okinawa and saying, I'm not seeing things that make sense to me. So I went and researched Japanese radar as a part of the section 22 interest group. And this is related to it. What you're looking at right is the undersea cables that were throughout the Japanese Empire in 1945. What you'll see is there's a cable that goes from Kyushu through the Ryukyus to Formosa, today's Taiwan. What this meant was Japanese radars and Japanese signals intelligence units sitting on those different places could talk to each other and talk to 5th Naval Air Fleet headquarters in Kagoshima by these undersea cables and not be intercepted by code breakers listening to radios. So what this meant was, while the Navy thought it knew what was going on, it really didn't have a good idea of how many radars were available to the Japanese at Okinawa. What you see there on the right is the work of about 3 years worth of research, locating every single Japanese radar on Okinawa, who controlled them, who belonged to them, and what frequencies they were on and the ranges. This is important because the radars that you see over here that say 150 for their frequency could make Allied identification friend or foe ping. That is, a radar that didn't have very much range, when it put out that signal and hit an American aircraft out to 300 kilometers, would see where it was. So the islands that you saw where there were cables, undersea cables, could see where the different picket patrols were. And they had about 10 days before this to figure out where all these patrol spots were and build a plan. Now,
just a question for you from David O'Keefe, the
right.
wonderful, if we mention his name 3 times and Ultra arrives, where he arrives, we mention Ultra. Anyway, he is asking, when was it finally discovered by the Allies that Japanese were using cables?
After the campaign.
And my second, thank you for that. My second question would be, I think I may have asked that in the first time you were on, even by 44, 45, is there a general lack of understanding amongst the Allies that the Japanese have the sophistication they do with regards radar and other science, in that all that kind of years of banzai charges and kind of low-end stuff, low-tech stuff has kind of affected our thinking that everything they do is a bit primitive?
There was a lot of personalities involved with intelligence on the Japanese, especially on the electronic warfare side of and radar side of the ledger. Admiral King in Washington, D.C. had 3 groups of people that he disliked intensely. 1, the British. 2, everyone involved with the Army Air Force, because the Navy was against an independent Air Force for a whole lot of reasons. And Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur put together, through his chief signal officer, General Aiken, the best radar and radio intelligence outfit in the Pacific War. And throughout, from the last quarter of 1943 to June of 1945, there was a fight between MacArthur and the Joint Chiefs, with King as the lead, over whether or not the Japanese were exploiting Mark III IFF. MacArthur did not get a definitive proof that our IFF was being used by the Japanese until June of 1945. So the idea that the Japanese were using IFF was widely known as a possibility by late, that is October, November, December of 1944, but the Navy, specifically in the form of Admiral King, refused to acknowledge this. And there were lots of people at lower levels and to the lower level of flag ranks involved in late that were seeing things that, yeah, it certainly looks like the Japanese are using our IFF somehow. But this did not make it into naval doctrine because at that time, the Pac-10 doctrine that governed the Navy was under King's thumb. Therefore, the Navy didn't learn. We'll touch on that a little bit. What this particular slide is about is the U.S. Navy was horribly insecure with its use of radio during the course of World War II. U.S. naval radio fighter direction channels controlling these planes were generally clear. There were very few code words that were used. They were called shackle codes. So you replace certain words to mean other things. But it's not hard after listening for a few hours that chick might mean fighter and that pancake might mean landing. And one of the escort group commanders made this specific complaint in the after action reports that I reviewed building this. What you see there on the left is the Ryukyus Islands. Every place in yellow has an airfield, and generally, except for Kiyagijima, which was connected to Amani Ojima, was on the main line to 5th Air Fleet. And what you're seeing in center and right are respectively the Imperial Japanese Navy and Imperial Japanese Army radar locations in the Ryukyus. All right. We were talking about cables earlier and what people didn't know. What you're looking at right is the tentative operations plan for the invasion of the Ryukyus and Okinawa specifically. And in the big yellow squiggle is where the Navy thought that the telephone and telegraph cable landed on Okinawa. Well, it got it half right. It left Okinawa at Higuchi Beach, but it actually landed from down Ryukyus chain to Formosa at Naha. The face you're seeing there is Admiral Minoru Ota. He was the head of the naval forces in the Ryukyus chain. He wore 3 or 4 separate hats. So he controlled all of the military forces from Kyushu to Formosa. And this is where you get into personalities and politics. In 1944, U.S. Army Civil Affairs identified correctly that the cables landed in Naha and left from Higuchi. In 1953, I found a Pacific Science Board report repeating the same thing. And we know for a fact that the cable was used as late as June because Admiral Ota's last message that before he killed himself was about telling the Japanese emperor, please remember the sacrifices of the Okinawa people to defend Japan. I mean, most other generals and admirals talk about, the glories of sacrificing and Bushido. His last message was about the people of Okinawa. He's become, because of that, something of a folk hero amongst the Okinawan people. All right. We're going to get into a touchy subject here because we have a lot of historians, naval historians, particularly Trent, talking about how the U.S. Navy had turned into a learning organization. Well, my research does not agree with that. And we're going to go into why because of the things that I found in the Okinawa campaign. This is from a U.S. Army document. One of the anti-aircraft people in Coast Artillery Corps, a Lieutenant Colonel R.H. Holt, was talking in the Military Review, which is the House organ for the U.S. Army war colleges that are in Kansas, said specifically, in many amphibious operations of the past war, the anti-aircraft protection of some of the phases was completely overlooked, due at times to the haste of organization in conducting the operations. But generally, it was due to the lack of understanding and comprehension of how the U.S. Army's anti-aircraft arm operated. What you're seeing on right is in that figure is an anti-aircraft searchlight pattern, which is protecting the defended area. And you'll see how it was all about trying to pick up airplanes at a distance so that by the time they get close enough for for anti-aircraft artillery, they could put accurate shells on target to make the bombers miss. All right. One of the things that Trent Hone kept pointing out is there was one Navy and everyone learned. When it comes to friendly fire, it simply never happened. The U.S. Navy did not war game friendly fire in the interwar period. So it wasn't something they really thought about. This showed up at Gela at Sicily in July of 1943. A stream of paratrooper-filled C-47s flew over the U.S. Navy fleet, and they were blown out of the sky. 23 C-47s were shot down, with 81 killed and 16 missing. The SHAEF put together a very systematic friendly fire prevention plan that went into every level, but especially for controlling anti-aircraft artillery. What you're looking here is at a pair of documents. The one to the immediate right is from an anti-aircraft artillery an Army anti-aircraft artillery document detailing what you should do to prevent friendly fire if you're being attacked by aircraft. Don't shoot, put out these markers. What you're looking at bottom is something that Admiral Spruance said 3 April 1945. He's talking about the same sort of protective plans being used. But look, what you're seeing directly above his quotation is from October of 1944. If Admiral Spruance is talking about this off of Okinawa, April 3rd, 1945, the fleet that was supporting the landings in the Mediterranean and at Normandy learned all of those things, and it was not transmitted through Washington, D.C. to the Pacific Fleet.
To just ask a question again, Trent, because I like asking questions, and to just give you a break to take a swig of drink. This idea of the U.S. Navy not learning and friendly fire, maybe was something that was not on their, pun intended, radar. Is that because it's one of those things that militaries have had to accept the fact that friendly fire or blue on blue is just a part of warfare, and it's always going to happen. Claudius stabbed Marcus with swords in Carthage 2,000 years ago because he tripped over and stabbed his best mate. It's something that's going to happen, and it's something you can't avoid. And maybe don't sweat the small stuff. Isn't it better to get big doctrine sorted out, get amphibious doctrine worked out, get carrier tactics worked out? I'm not belittling anybody who's watching this who had a family member lost in a friendly fire incident. I'm not belittling their death. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not as important as the big stuff. Is that a controversial point? What's your reaction to that, Trent?
Well, one of the things I did researching this was also look at how the Royal Navy dealt with it.
Right.
And they had a hold fire if you think it's friendly, whereas the Navy was, if it flies, it dies.
Right.
The U.S. Navy had a much more sanguinary view of it. We need to protect the capital ship from whatever is coming. And if the screen gets shot up a little, we'll accept it. Well, the problem is friendly fire isn't, and what goes up must come down. And if you've got an entire fleet engaging one friendly aircraft that is flying over friendly forces, you're going to have a huge amount of damage caused by that one incident. And the U.S. Navy was thinking strictly in terms of carrier battle groups or battleship battle lines engaging. They weren't thinking about, well, how are we going to defend an amphibious anchorage where we've got airfields right next to our ships, we've got airplanes in the air, and the enemy is attacking? No thoughts were put into this particular situation. And it showed up in the United States doctrine of, senior officer present afloat. There should have been some sort of work to get that doctrine thinking, how am I going to get my ground-based air defenses, whether they are Marine or Army, to work with my fleet-based air defenses? And because there was not enough thought about that in the plan, things went sideways badly. And we'll get to that a little later. I'm going to deal with another thing that in the Pacific that had to do with electronic warfare and signals intelligence that should have gone from Fifth Fleet to Third Fleet, but was ignored. And what I'm talking about here is Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet communication officer caught the Japanese using someone speaking colloquial English out of Okinawa, attempting to do radio deceptions. All right. Everyone in the senior levels of the U.S. Navy knew that Naha was one of the pre-war signals intelligence hardpoints for the Japanese Empire. From there, they could listen to Luzon, they could listen to Hong Kong, they can listen to the Russians. The Japanese put a lot of really smart people with really good language skills at that place. So this is something that should have been in the documentation. I mean, you see, earlier in the presentation, all those different reports. But the idea that on Okinawa, you had people listening to all our open traffic that knew colloquial English and were using it against the American Navy and American Armed Forces did not penetrate into the planning for Operation Iceberg. All right, next slide. So this, to sum up beachhead area defense at Okinawa. The U.S. Army, where there were installations to be defended, drew a bomb release line around it and snuggled their headquarters up next to the Air Force commander and put together something they called an AAOR and a AAAIS. That is an Air and Aircraft Operations Room and an Anti-Aircraft Information Service. This was much like the RAF Fighter Command's control of aircraft, except this is for controlling guns, and they wanted to make sure they turned off their guns when proper Allied aircraft were coming through so they didn't get shot down. The U.S. Navy did not think this through. Beachhead air defense will be provided by the United States Navy through its SOPA. When you go try and look through doctrine for SOPA about how to integrate ground-based air defenses, you don't find much, if anything. And the U.S. Marine Corps had a different thought. We'll do beachhead air defense after the amphibious assault, after the Navy leaves. So in the interim between the start of the landing and the end of the assault was a huge void in doctrine that the Army only partially filled because it was doing its own thing. You told me to defend the airfield. This is how I do it. All right, now, Chapter 5. We're going to talk about friendly fire when the kamikazes come calling. All right. What you're looking at here is the location of every 90 millimeter gun battery and associated SER 584 gun fire control radar on Okinawa at 2 April, 11 April, and 30 June 1945. Look hard on the left. That map was in effect and covered 6 April 1945. When the Marine Corps broke and did open field running to the north of Okinawa, there was a logistical cost. All of the LVTs, which would have been moving gear and equipment off the ships, and all the trucks that were supporting it that would have been moving gear and equipment off the ships, went north. So the Marine air warning squadrons and the 2 Marine anti-aircraft battalions were still sitting on boats come 6 April. When you look at that map, you'll see that Yantan has nothing. It was as bare of anti-aircraft defenses as the bottom of a newborn baby. Now, this is a photo that is to orient you for the next map that's coming. What you're seeing there is the 24th Corps landing beaches south of Bishigawa. The arrow there is pointing where 2 YOGL barges, each filled with 5,000 barrels of aviation fuel, were located. All of those ships, or at least a significant percentage of them, close to the black arrowhead, were hit by friendly fire. That list that I had early on shows approximately where that F-2M was shot down, and everyone in the sky was tracking that as it went down. And when it went down, all of those ships were shot in the back. This is where we get into how good the Japanese were. And I'm going to pull up something here. When the Japanese probed the northern radar picket stations on 6 April 1945, they had been watching the operational patterns of the target cap division. There were 11 divisions of 4 fighter planes that were up in the sky at the beginning of the day, supporting the picket stations. As I mentioned before, the radio channels they had been listening to for almost 10 days. They had broken all the shackle codes. They knew what the calls meant because they had people who knew colloquially English sitting at Naha that they could communicate through this cable to Kagoshima. The need to bounce it through 4 or 5 stations meant it wasn't quick, but it gave them 4 or 5 hour old up-to-date information on where the American fighters were. And what this meant was late in the afternoon of 6 April, between 12 noon and 6 p.m., saw the first of a massive coordinated Kikasui raids departing from Kyushu for Okinawa with all the accumulated intelligence lessons of the previous 4 days. And they had a plan. Admiral Matome Ugaki was the commander of 5th Air Fleet. He sent half conventional, half kamikaze mixed force of 120 planes at Task Force 58. This was to keep them busy. In the event, only 60 of these planes actually found the carriers. The other 60 went south to Okinawa because they couldn't find the carriers. What this meant was they wound up being a vanguard for the land-based raids, which were scheduled to show up at about 3 o'clock, that is 1500 hours. Between 14:30 and 6 p.m. local time, waves of kamikazes broke through, and look at the left map. You're going to see numbers. Picket stations 1 and 2 were occupied by USS Bush and USS Calhoun. When the kamikazes showed up, there weren't enough aircraft on station. 44 was not enough for what was coming. Those picket destroyers called back to the carriers, which were also dealing with their own attacks, and they wound up sending cap. But there was a problem. The Japanese knew the timing. That is 90 minutes on station from where the American carriers were. So they could time these raids such that they would have a raid blow through when all the fighters were out of fuel and having to go back. So the first of the destroyers to feel this was USS Bush. A wave of 50 kamikazes showed up at RP-1, and about 13 engaged, an engager, and another 13 showed up for Bush's sister ship, the USS Cashin Young, at radio picket station number 3. Here's 1. Let's see if I can get this. Here's 1, and here's 3. So what happened was the cap at RP3 was busy. Cap at RP1 was overwhelmed. the destroyer at RP2 came over to help and sent over its fighters. The problem was the Japanese ran the American picket destroyers out of fighters. So what happened was the USS Bush took a hit. Then she was struck by a Yokosuka D4Y Suzy, or a Comet dive bomber known to the Navy as a Judy. This left her with neither operable engines nor electrical power. The radar point went blind. You can't control aircraft if you don't have radio and if you don't have radar. And they use backup batteries for short range radios to call for help, but that basically made it next to the next picket station, not all the way back to the carriers. In the middle of these two melees, at RP1 and RP3, at RP2, USS Calhoun went over to help the USS Bush, and she got slammed into as well. So by 4:30, there was a hole in the picket screen wherein waves of Japanese kamikazes came down. And that is the path that came down. On the right is a U.S. Marine radar permanent echo map. All these black places are where radar on the ocean could not see through. So you see when the Japanese broke through these areas and came straight down, they could not be seen from Higuchi Beach and from the USS El Dorado, which was the primary command ship for the air defenses of Okinawa. All right, let's go to next. All right, what you're looking at here is what happened over Higuchi Beach. What you're seeing are tracks of Japanese kamikazes coming in. The Japanese kamikazes came down from the north, and basically around 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, things went south over Higuchi Beach. Let's see if I can find. The Japanese, after years of war, were well aware of the limitations of radar, and particularly U.S. naval radar overland. The kamikazes that made it through radar picket stations number 1 through 4 used that knowledge to evade American radar coverage south of the pickets. It was a simple matter of geography. Sea level based radars looking over land had many blocked lines of sight that were overwhelmed by the permanent echoes, such that small aircraft that were in those permanent echoes, that is flying over a hill, could not be seen. And when they dropped down on the other side of the hill, the reflection of that hill mass blinded the radar as the aircraft was getting closer. Between the inability of U.S. Navy ship-based SC and SK early radar to see over land and a lack of Marine heavy anti-aircraft artillery fire control radars at Yantan Field, Japanese kamikazes that broke through RPs 1 through 4 had a free ride to Higuchi Beach via flying just inland over the northwest coast of Okinawa. Waves of these pilots, some well coordinated, broke over Okinawa's Mabutu Peninsula north of Point Bolo and found the destroyer screen of both Admiral Deo's Western Bombardment Force and the ASW screen and flycatcher patrols looking for Japanese suicide motorboats of Admiral Turner's screen commander, Captain Moosbrugger. Destroyers and destroyer minesweepers, Hollowworth, Heyman, Lutzi, and Newcomb were all hit between 1627 and 1806 hours. That is 4:30 to 6:06 p.m. Luckily for the U.S. Navy transports at Higuchi Beach, these pilots were inexperienced and had poor navigational skills. The savage defense of U.S. Navy and USMC pilots at the radar picket stations took a hand in this. The coordinated waves of kamikazes that arrived at those picket stations leaked through those stations, much less so. Many of the experienced pilots who were shepherding those who were not got shot down before they reached northern Okinawa to navigate in coordinated waves.
Just a question from David O'Keefe. Were there any warnings coming through Ultra? They usually cooperated quite nicely with the radar pickets off Okinawa.
The answer is yes, provisionally. Ultra warned that there was a big wave coming. The wave was originally planned for April 3rd. It got delayed because of weather and because of the weather, the Japanese could not get their reconnaissance aircraft to get a good close look. So the Navy was sitting there with its Ultra information while the Japanese were getting their act together those 3 days for weather. And when the Japanese showed up, a cap force of 44 planes facing waves of 120 aircraft are going to be overwhelmed. And that's what happened. The Navy was not used to the size of air raids that were a tenth of the size of what the Allies were throwing at the Germans in Europe.
Right.
And this is where the Ugaki's plan came together to reduce the effectiveness of the naval gunners at Higuchi Beach, beginning just after midnight and for irregular intervals covering the 4 hours between midnight and 6:30. Japanese night heckler planes were approaching or orbiting Okinawa, keeping those sailors at their guns without sleep all night. About 6 hours later, at 12:15, the first kamikaze raid closed Higuchi Beach and attempted to crash on the battleship USS West Virginia and failed. That's, I believe, over here. Then 3 hours later, after that, the kamikazes began leaking through the radar picket ship in earnest and would do so for the next 4 hours. The USS El Dorado would count 22 raids on 6 April 1945, closing Higuchi Beach, rather than the 12 that the IJN sent over 2 days. This was due in part to the raids from Formosa, but primarily because of the efforts of the U.S. Navy and Marine fighter pilots at the picket stations. They shattered these large raids into a lot of smaller ones. And the wanderings of the now unescorted, inexperienced pilots played a big role in confusing the air picture for El Dorado and its Combat Information Center. For example, the salvage tug USS Pakina, the ATR 108, operating off of Brown Beach with 6 CB warping tuggets, reported a general alert was called at 4 p.m., an all clear at 4:30. Then at 5 p.m., a northern alert was sent. The officer in tactical command, aka Turner, sent out warnings that suicide and torpedo planes were closing Higuchi anchorage. Unfortunately, 2 of these 22 raids over Higuchi Beach were in fact U.S. Navy fighters. All right.
Just a quick question again. You may be covering this in a minute. Sean Brennan is asking, was radar seen as the primary stroke only trusted source for air defense? Surely the fighter patrols over the radar pickets could have radioed back situation reports.
This gets into a lot of technical stuff that I left out, trying not to confuse people, but I'll make it short and sweet. U.S. Navy carrier groups had, in addition to their radars, small radio signals intelligence teams. The El Dorado did not get one of these intelligence teams until 30 April.
Right.
So this additional level of information that American carrier admirals were using as a matter of course had not at this time been integrated into air defense operations at amphibious beaches. So yes, El Dorado listened to the picket stations, but this was the biggest operation of this kind to date. The Navy had gotten a lot of things wrong, and the Navy's ability to control aircraft on a scale of continental air operations was lacking. That is, the ability to throw a couple of squadrons at a incoming wave of aircraft is nothing compared to what a 1940 British fighter sector was doing when it was throwing a half a dozen fighters at a incoming Luftwaffe strike.
Right.
And the ability of a land-based fighter direction center to have more bandwidth than on a ship was a big reason why you had much larger air battles in Europe than you did over the U.S. Navy. This was the first time the U.S. Navy ran into Continental class air power. That's hundreds of aircraft in a wave, not dozens. This made a huge difference in what went down. And even the largest waves that the U.S. Navy faced in the Battle of the Philippine Sea still had the complete bell, book, and candle of signals intelligence, radar intelligence, and really good fighter director teams on the carriers. El Dorado had some good fighter director teams, mind you, but they weren't the first string. The first string was with the carrier battle groups. Now, this map that you see on the right is why I put out the photograph earlier. South, that's 24th Corps. This is the Marine Corps, that Corps size unit that landed at Higuchi Beach. The barges that I've talked about were sitting right there. This is Point Bolo. This was the planned route for aircraft in distress to land at Yantan Beach in the event they declared an emergency. The idea of a landing approach pattern to an airfield that you're using next to a landing beach filled with stationary amphibious shipping directly over your aviation fuel supply for the operation in the middle of repeated kamikaze attacks proved to be a horribly bad idea. I don't have the name of the F-6F pilot that was killed earlier in the day. I do have the name of the Wildcat pilot that was shot down and who the debris landed in those two YOGLs. The man's name was Lieutenant J.G. A.S. Bazell. He flew off the escort carrier USS Laguna Point. Next slide. On the left, you're looking at a 10th Army after action report. The F-6F was downed at 4:15 in the afternoon, 1650. At 5:05, that is 1705, the F-4F identified, the U.S. Army used F-4F to cover any Wildcat, however the Navy called it, was shot at by someone with a machine gun on the beach. Not someone controlled by the anti-aircraft people in the U.S. Army, but someone, oh my God, after hours and hours of being hit by air attacks, another airplane racked his 50 caliber and started shooting. And then everything exploded like a volcano. And as that plane tracked, it waggled its wings. Hey, I'm friendly. Well, some people thought he was doing evasive action. In any case, he was destroyed. In the process, on the ground, you had 7 more people killed, Americans, and another 90 injured, wounded. This is, you see that over here, but not here. This is a 1949 report by the anti-aircraft battalion that had been in charge of the Army air defenses at Okinawa. And this was a major inter-service black mark between Turner and the Army. It would have been big as Smith versus Smith, but everyone was keeping the friendly fire incident secret. Career reasons. Now, this is where we get to where the rubber meets the road. How did these disasters affect the operation? What you're seeing on the right there is the oil and aviation gasoline dump for Kadena Airfield. When that FM2 was shot down, every ship off the beach tracked it all the way down into those barges. A torrent of fire, incoming ammo has the right of way. Well, the right of way here destroyed all the 55-gallon drums of aviation fuel that had come ashore to provide Marine Corsair fighters fuel to operate off of Kadena Airfield. The U.S. Navy did not bring extra barrels to the operation. So what happened was The water barrels that were brought to provide potable water for the Marines were dumped. They were filled with aviation fuel, used temporarily. When they were emptied, when the larger tanker farms were built, they were again filled with water. And this is why Eugene Sledge complained vociferously about his water being contaminated by aviation fuel. This was the reason why. Marine Corps fighters were supposed to land on that airfield the evening of the 6th. They wound up coming down and operating there beginning the 9th of April. That's just the beginning of the delays caused by this event. What you're seeing here on the right is a YOGL barge and how it was used in the New Guinea theater in 1944 early, and eventually copied by the Navy at in the Marianas in June of 44, and used again at Iwo Jima, Leyte, Luzon, and Okinawa. The Navy was, what you see here is the phase one, when you tie up the barge next to the shore and you put a pipeline to the airfield. Eventually, you build tanks and then you bring in coastal tankers to replace the barges. Well, the Navy sank the barges. They blew up cans, barrels and barrels of fuel. So the Navy had to fight logistically for fuel the rest of the campaign. This is the plan. Essentially, you would have 250 fighters and about 280 bombers by the end of May. This included 130 odd B-25s and about 140 B-24 4-engine bombers. This is what actually happened. By the end of May, they finally had the 200 odd fighters, but there were no bombers. You did not get the twin engine and 4-engine bombers until July and August of 1945. This was because of that friendly fire incident. Now, I had mentioned earlier about the Hobbs victory being blown up and losing all of the mortar ammunition. What you see on the right, every hill in Okinawa had a dead zone because there was no mortar ammunition, and all of the VT fused 105 millimeter ammo that was available in the Pacific was on those two ships. So suddenly, for the duration of the campaign, because of that incident, the U.S. ground forces did not have enough mortars to suppress the backsides of hills. So when you hear about the 6th Marine Division impaling itself over and over and over again, it's because the Japanese were hiding in that dead space that the lack of mortar ammunition caused throughout the campaign. All right. In the aftermath of the war being over, you started seeing a lot of changes in the narrative. And what I mean is, this is from a report dated November of 1945, talking about the radar picket stations and mentioning in passing where land-based radars were. What they left out was, early on, there were a whole bunch of radars landed right here. 3, 4, 5 August from the U.S. Army, and they had the Marine stuff landing 6, 7 April. It's not listed here. And when I went and checked amphibious operations, capture of Okinawa, Ryukyu's operation, 27 March to 21 June 45, the friendly fire incident was on the wrong day. And the Navy said it wasn't YOGL barges. It was pontoon barges, completely different kind of equipment. So I went to the Fold 3 site and I did a tabular record of movements for every YOGL barge in the Pacific from January of 1945 to the end of the war. That you see over here. You'll note quite a few barges kind of like disappeared, and I could not find them. And I spent months combing through that. Someone or several someones went out of their way to remove that from the historical record. So this leaves a whole lot of historians with a big problem. If we catch the Navy and the staff of Admiral Nimitz not telling the complete truth, then it requires us to use a much finer tooth comb going through the records to see where else that has happened. So this is why being a DoD auditor comes in handy when you're looking at government documents. When you spend 33 years trying to find lies in government documents, you're pretty good at it. All right, next one. All right, I call this Nemesis Island for a reason. And my opening and the closing are built around the fact that there was a whole lot of inter-service politics going on that poisoned this operation. And the biggest one was the fact that the War and Navy departments were going to be merged at the end of the war, and Okinawa was the last big battle. The incentives of that future power struggle poisoned the planning and execution of this operation and its narrative construction for what we understand after the war. All right. And this is how I put it, a little pop culture. The shroud of the dark side has fallen on Okinawa, begun the unifications war have, and Palpatine, good, good, let the hate flow through you from our future roles and missions. I think that if there are any more questions, that's pretty much the end of the presentation.
Well, brilliant. And there are some questions. So we'll do the questions now. So, yeah, fantastic stuff, Trent, as I knew it would be. So first question about the ammo shortage. Would that ammo issue have had a significant impact on casualties in the ground campaign?
Yes. One of the things that I went through, and I've been trying to find it since I saw it, was a discussion by a mortarman saying that for this one attack for his division, he ignored the daily limits on ammo and he did a box barrage into the backside of one of the hills. And the attacks that had been failing and failing suddenly succeeded because the box barrage wiped out the Japanese reaction force and let this U.S. Army force capture the top of the hill. If mortars had been around in the scale that had been available on those two victory ships, I have no doubt that the U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps would have chewed through the hills of Okinawa much faster because they would have had the firepower on the backside of the hills to stop the Japanese counterattacks from pushing them off.
Right. Okay. Now this next question, I fear there's a one-word answer and there's an hour-long answer. We'll do the first one. Ian Carr, were these radar coordination issues resolved by the Allies when off the Japanese mainland?
It was still a problem. I've looked deeply through the Operation Downfall documents, and there was an ongoing fight between Admiral Turner's staff and the staff of the 5th Air Force about how to apply ground-based fighters to support the invasion. And there was all sorts of problems with how many radio frequencies belonged to which organization and how they were going to integrate and when you were going to allow bombers. It was just a mess.
Right. Okay. This is a slightly off topic, but it's a good question. Stuart Buxton is asking, was there a significant threat from Japanese submarines operating and did it affect the operation?
Short answer, yes. Longer answer, one of the destroyer minesweepers that the Navy claims as having been sunk by a mine was in fact sunk by Admiral Ota's local mini-sub outfit. They put one into a destroyer minesweeper and killed it. There were other submarines coming in. The U.S. Navy had some really good ASW forces there at the time, but the Japanese at one point coordinated air and sea attacks in the evenings where submarines were coming in, so the ASW escorts were piling on, and then came the kamikazes. And suddenly, the ability to do combined arms at sea, when you're using air and submarine together to go after a screen, was incredibly powerful. The Japanese pulled it off a couple of times.
Okay. Thank you. Another one, for potentially a rabbit hole. Ian Carr is asking, had the Allies discussed this, and were the Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy forces off Okinawa running the same systems and coordinating with the US Navy?
Complicated question. I'll try and give a small answer. The Royal Navy was more skilled at fighter direction than the United States Navy, even at that point in the war. The problem that the Royal Navy had was its carriers had much less in the way of fighters. Doesn't matter how good your fighter direction is, if you only have 4 fighters against a 12 incoming plane wave of kamikazes. The British had an incredible asset in the Seafire. A lot of people give it guff because it crashed a lot. That had been fixed by the time of the Okinawa campaign. And the Seafire was the fastest climbing aircraft fighter in the Pacific theater at that time. So while the British did not have a lot of planes in the air, they usually had a few on their carrier. They could get to high altitude damned fast to pick off an incoming kamikaze. So yes, both navies coordinated and cooperated on fighter direction. The British were tasked with one area in the southern Ryukyus, whereas the American fleet was at the northern part of the Ryukyus, facing the biggest threat because they had more fighters. And the British could only last so long at the southern end of Ryukyus. They were replaced for a short time with escort carriers until the British fleet came back again to fill the role.
Yeah, no, good summary. And we did a show with Will Iredale about the British reaction to kamikazes. And if I kind of summarizing it in one sentence, it was the British peaked a little bit too late. Their anti-kamikaze, their carrier operations were just getting good as the war came to an end. If they got it just a little bit earlier, may have made a bit of a difference. But one more question from Gary Giamara here. Sounds like there was an evolution in kamikaze doctrine, as odd as that pairing of words sound, between the Philippines and Okinawa that caught the US Navy and Army unawares. Is that in any way correct?
He got it in one.
Super.
The big thing that was different between the Leyte campaign kamikazes and the Okinawa campaign kamikazes was the Japanese had the advantage of secure communications and quick communications. And with their radar network, they had a very good near live, within hours turnaround of really good intelligence as to the operational patterns that the American Navy had at Okinawa. So they could plan their strikes. Now, this did not fix the problem they had in believing really bad intelligence reports. But what it did mean was when they planned an attack, it was going to score. It may not score as much as they thought, but it was going to draw blood. And I don't know how much could have been saved if the Navy knew about how badly its IFF was being used. Because, look, the Navy had not spent a lot of time developing radar hunting aircraft like the American Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific did. If it had, maybe it could have hunted down some of these radars. But because it did not have that evolution, it fought in the Central Pacific. It wasn't fighting against huge continental air base systems like we're in Leyte, like we're in Luzon, like we're at Okinawa. When you're fighting a few islands that have 30, 40, 50 airplanes, and you can bring the Essex carrier swarm with, I've got 10 carriers plus, half a dozen light carriers bringing 1,000 airplanes. Well, you're going to win. I mean, there's the correlation of forces is adverse for the Japanese. At Okinawa, the Japanese did not have good pilots, but they still had good planners. And they had the kamikaze concept, and the combination was deadly.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question from David O'Keefe, which I've got to find it again now. And it is about, where is it? I've got to scroll back up and find it. I had it there a second ago. There we go. Has Trent delved into this aspect in relation to the sinking of Yamato?
The Navy knew Yamato was coming.
Right.
The battle line was like, oh boy, let's go get him. Under Admiral Dale. The aircraft people said, no, we're gonna. So they basically moved out to go get before battle line could show up. Why give a sucker an even break? So we've got an Essex carrier swarm. We can throw hundreds of airplanes at this one battleship. Why risk getting shot at by Yamato?
Yeah.
I can't argue with it. That's a smart move.
Well, we will leave it there. People are complimenting you in the sidebar about how quickly you put this presentation together. I mean, you had written an article, but yes, you have put the presentation together. So it would have been good anyway, but it was good in 48 hours notice, especially good. So I can't wait to see you back on again with a bit more preparation time next time. That would be really cool. I'll give you a bit more warning. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second to remind people what we're coming up. I'll bring you back in a second to say goodbye. So, folks, the important thing about tomorrow's show is it's 2 hours earlier. Michael Nelson is joining me from Australia. He's staying up, so 1 in the morning, his time to join me. So it's 5 p.m. UK time for an incredibly interesting presentation about Fremantle, the harbour in Australia. So it's going to cover submarines. It's going to cover the fortress that was developed there to defend it. It's going to cover the fact they set out the Z-Force operations from there. There's going to be talk about female volunteers in the harbour there. It's going to cover a whole myriad of things. I'm looking forward to that. And Michael is another one of those World War II TV viewers who's making the transition from being a viewer to a presenter. And that is deliberately intended, at least one person watching this show today, to encourage that person, no names, it's you, Susan, to come forward and do a show at some point. It's not about being a qualified, millions of books out there, best-selling author to be on my channel like David O'Keefe. We will take people who have just got an incredible interest and knowledge and passion for their subject. So don't feel shy about stepping forward and volunteering your information. Any of you watching this, if you've got a presentation, we'll fit it in somehow. But right now, I'm going to bring Trent back in to say thank you very much, and we will see each other at some point in due course. It's been great talking to you. Yeah, that's it for everybody. Thanks for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I'll see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.